I've never been great at pretending to love just anybody, but I have come around to the realization that there's probably something to love and to praise in just about everybody. Hi, and welcome back to the 50/50 Project, where every week I talk through an item on a list made up of one thing I've learned for each year I've lived. So this week, we're back in the communications category with thing number 20, keep your tributes true. You know, I have never, ever been very good at communicating things that I don't really feel or believe, and I have never been good at performing emotions that aren't really there. If I don't particularly like someone, I can sometimes have a hard time acting like I do. And even if I like somebody well enough, I still have a hard time performing deeper affection when I'm not quite there in my heart of hearts just yet, even if that's the socially acceptable thing to do in this situation. For example, some people are just a lot more comfortable throwing around the word love than I am. And a very few of those same people expect everybody else to be equally fast and loose with that word. But I don't say it very much. And I can feel resentful, and as my mother would have said, contrary, when I'm pressured to fake it. I can vividly remember visiting a family member when I was a really little kid, like maybe 4, to see a person I didn't see very often at all. And at the end of the visit, this person said to me, "Give me a hug goodbye and tell Auntie Redacted that you love her." And I said something like, "I don't know you well enough to love you, but you seem like a really nice person." And I'm sure my father wanted to fall through the floor in horror, because this was someone very dear to him, and she was a very dear human being, but I didn't know her, and thus I would never have felt comfortable saying I loved her. Even then, even at a really young age, I resisted communicating an affection I didn't feel. Now, to be clear, none of this is to say that there was anything wrong with that relative all those years ago, no more than there's anything morally wrong with a coworker that I don't happen to click with. Sometimes it's about time, and sometimes it's just about chemistry, and often it's both. So it's not really a reflection on anybody but me and my own personal bonding process. And even in cases where there is something concrete that I object to about someone in my orbit, there's usually also a much greater proportion of good in them, and I can look at that and recognize it for what it is. That person who, takes long lunches every single day. She might very well be the same person who's willing to work late before deadlines or who volunteers to pick up a team member at the airport almost every time. Most of the time, for me, it's a matter of just not clicking or not clicking yet with an otherwise very good human being. So the reality is, people aren't simple stories. They're complex, dense narratives with intricately braided plots. And this is good news for those of us who don't want to fake it, because when it comes to communicating with and about these very complicated beings, we typically don't have to lie to be of use. Most of the time, we really don't have to make up an idealized or fictionalized tribute to have something affirmative to say to others or on their behalf. Over the years, I've learned to stay authentic in what I say when I pay tribute by staying focused, by being reflective, and remaining in my own lane and scope. That's a process that challenges me to really look deeply into a person or our connection and recognize the good that's already genuinely there. To focus selectively and strategically on whatever positive, affirmative, complimentary things I can honestly say about a person, a place, a situation, or whatever, keeping my tributes true. And that process has turned out to be kind of important to me, both personally and professionally. I was asked a couple weeks ago to write a letter of recommendation for someone I used to work with, which in this case was really easy to do because she was an awesome coworker and I really, really liked her as a person and a coworker, both. But I used to write a lot more of these kinds of recommendations when I was teaching at the university for students who were on the job market or who wanted to go on to grad school. The best letter I can write for someone in that circumstance is an honest one, one that is self-limiting in that it really focuses in on what John or Sue specifically was great at in their undergrad classes with me as a direct witness. A generic testimony about what a great person he or she is, or how much we all loved them, doesn't really help Duke, for example, make a decision about their admission to the MBA program there. But a letter that describes well-argued essays or a capacity to make space for others in a classroom discussion, well, that's a lot more useful in that moment. It's more authentic, it's truer to how I would actually be expected to know a student, and therefore it probably resonates more powerfully with this particular kind of reader. And I wrote letters for all kinds of students over the years, and none of these students were perfect, and never did I make claims to that effect. And sometimes the best letters I wrote ended up being on behalf of students who had even struggled slightly with some aspect of the work in my class, but who were clearly driven and resilient and talented. I didn't have to lie about their innate affinity for poetry scansion or whatever, but I was happy to focus instead on the way they took and implemented feedback, or their capacity to ask questions that got us all closer to mastery. And because my praise was genuine and specific, it read as such. It sounded much more trustworthy than a glowing 360-degree gushing letter probably would have. Only rarely I've had to decline to write rec letters, which is hard for both people involved. But my guess is that they were able to find other professors in other classes who simply knew them better, who had spent more time with them, had seen sides of them that I hadn't yet. That's the kind of recommender you want anyway. That's the tribute you hope for. One who will be able to talk about real strengths and specific examples. And I think that's a big part of this lesson that I've learned over the years. When we can't pay tribute to someone without straining the limits of what we know to be true, I think it's a sign that we aren't the right ones to be doing it in the first place. Until my former coworker asked a couple days ago, it had actually been a long while since I'd written one of those rec letters. And I think the demand for formal letter form recommendations, it's probably down these days, I'm guessing. It isn't something that most of us are going to be asked to do too much anymore. But in other ways, I think we're being called upon to speak for others more than ever before. Maybe it's a LinkedIn endorsement. Maybe it's an email survey from the bank about the teller that you interacted with last week. Often, it might be something like a Google or a Yelp review that your barista says she would love for you to write, maybe for her coffee house that's just now getting off the ground. So, thinking about how to speak of and for others has become an even more important part of figuring out our own personal set of communications ethics, I think. And that's very true in both personal and professional lives, I think. I think technology and social media in particular has tasked us with more and more personal tributes, has given us far more opportunities and maybe even obligations to speak to and for the people in our personal orbits, but out here in a public forum. It's a quick change, it's a big change, and it's kind of a weird change when you really think about it. Like 15 years ago, we had no idea what our best friend's husband might want to say to his wife on her birthday, or what our aunt's neighbor might think about her sudden passing. But we do now. Today we're privy to a whole lot of heretofore private thoughts and emotions, celebrations, elegies, and tributes. I guess there's always been the formal eulogy, of course. I've delivered one of those in my time, just one in my whole life, for my father at his funeral. But since the advent of social media, I have felt called many, many times over to speak either to the loss of a friend or to the loss suffered by a friend. And I think most of us have. We're all becoming eulogists, not just at one or two pivotal moments in our own lives, but far more often. For some reason, social media gives us a new vehicle for the human instinct to speak in tribute. And it seems to hold a new space, not just for close family and friends, but for much more distant relations and acquaintances to speak, particularly, I think, about loss. And I think that's potentially very beautiful and also potentially very tricky. So I try to hold to a few communications principles on those occasions. And I think most critically, I try to keep a really tight focus and a really humble scope. I try to only speak to the part of that person's life and character that I really shared or that I actually knew in some meaningful way. I have found that if I let things get too broad or too sweeping, they also seem to me to become less authentic and faithful somehow. I'll give you an example. I'm not in a position to say that one of my father's old friends was the greatest guy in the whole world in every possible and therefore no specific way, because I didn't know all the facets of who he was. And the people reading what I wrote in that moment of his loss would have known that I didn't know. And then it all starts to sound incredibly hollow and superficial, and like everything is just some all-encompassing and therefore pretty meaningless superlative. But fortunately, I didn't need that kind of scope in the first place, because I could focus in on what I knew through my own lived experience of this really remarkable person. As it happened, what I did know in this particular case through personal experience and observation was more than enough to help me share the tribute I really wanted to share, because I did know what a great friend he was to my dad. I had seen his quietly funny disposition. I had seen his pivotal role in welcoming my dad to a new town and a new community late in his life. I had witnessed his position at the center of their coffee club group. Those things are all windows into his bigger character as a whole, I think, but they all also matter on their own. I could offer a few tiny but really telling fragments in my tribute, which probably fit into a larger collective tribute, but I also was able to stay in my own lane. And I think it's important in this day and age when we are so hyper-connected with each other, when we have so many people that we're brushing up against at all times on social media. I think it's key to stay mindful of that lane, to not let technology carry me too far into other people's lives and losses, to not intrude too much on stories that aren't really mine to tell. I try to edit myself, I try to watch my scope, and leave most of the narrative oxygen for the people who have really earned the right to tell the heart of that particular story and that specific person. I think all of this becomes even more important when I find myself wanting to speak about someone or something with whom I've had an imperfect and maybe even troubled connection. In those moments when I truly feel called to speak across a rift as a bridge, I usually do. But again, I place my own limits around these kinds of situations. I try hard not to lie. I try hard not to sugarcoat or stretch the truth. I try hard not to misrepresent or overblow my role in my subject's life or theirs in mine. And I also never want to kick up dirt or air grievances in a situation like that. Like, how petty and sad would that be? But very often, there is some corner of even a sad or a fraught relational story that seems to want to be told in a moment like that. Something we shared, a kindness they offered me once, a period of my life where we walked the road together, or a thread that tied me to them even through division or strife. Nobody else needs to know about the division and strife. The thread is the point. The goodness, the affection, the joy, the beauty, that's what's worth sharing. That's what matters in that moment. Not inventing a better, alternate version of me or of them or of us, and not relitigating the sads or the mads of it all. Just letting the beauty that was always there in this imperfect but sacred thing out into the light. The bottom line is, if I feel called to speak for someone, it should be because something truly good and beautiful wants to show itself in tribute. And if that isn't there, if that isn't insistently trying to work its way to the surface, trying to be seen, it means that I'm not the right person to be speaking at that moment in the first place. Okay, so let's bracket the more casual stuff like the Yelp review or the bank teller survey, both of which I think it's perfectly fine to gush on a little bit because those people are working hard and they really need the good reviews. It can actually make a difference in their compensation, which I find odd, but it's true. Anyway, bracketing all of that stuff, I really think that in terms of my personal communications ethics, what I say on behalf of or in tribute to others, it's sort of sacred in my books. I think it's a place for a particularly fierce integrity. And that's why I don't throw testimony and love around like confetti. It's why I don't say things I don't mean, even in moments of tribute. And it's why I can get pretty stubborn when I feel pressure to pass those things out where I don't feel naturally compelled. And I think that's okay, actually. It's true that everybody deserves a tribute, but that doesn't mean that I'm always the right person to deliver it. Doesn't mean I'm obligated to fabricate one on demand. Doesn't mean I'm the best person to pull one from the ether every time. And actually, I think a forced, or worse, a false tribute is always a mistake in both directions. Because people can spot those. They can smell the insincere compliment or the undiscerning praise. We have a really good gut for that kind of thing. Others can sense it, and it makes them suspicious of the tribute and of both the giver and the recipient. Tribute should come from the heart. And if I don't find one there, aching to be shared, I should step back and keep my peace. And in doing so, I think maybe we all make some room for the probably countless others who do have something wholehearted and beautifully authentic to share. Okay, that's about enough of this for now. I hope your day is full of the kinds of people and experiences that inspire effortlessly true tributes. Thanks for spending some time with me today. I'll be back next week with thing number 21.